So if you remember the levels of biological organization, we had talked about the atoms, molecules, the macromolecules, and now we're going up to the organelles and then to the cells. And one important thing that you need to know is the cell theory. So this was a theory that was come up by some German scientists actually in the 1830s, and each of them were looking at a bunch of different organisms and noticed that they were all made of cells. So that's how they came up with the cell theory. And the cell theory just states that all living things are made up of one or more cells. And then the second part of the cell theory just states that the cell is the basic unit of life. And the third part of the cell theory just says that all cells come from pre-existing cells. So it's just saying that cells just don't appear out of nowhere, out of thin air. Cells have to divide, and that's how we form new cells. So I definitely would know the three parts of the cell theory and be able to identify those on the next exam. So that's pretty important to know. Okay, another thing that would be important to know is why cells are so small. So cells we have to take a look at underneath a microscope, and we just don't see gigantic cells. And the reason that cells are so small is that they need to be small so that they can transport enough materials across their cell membrane. So they need to be able to get the nutrients in and the waste products out to keep the cell alive. And if you have a larger cell, as the cell grows larger, the volume of stuff inside the cell is going to grow at a faster rate than the surface area of the cell will. And so that means that you're not going to be able to transport enough stuff in and out of the cell to keep the larger volume of this large cell alive. And so these large cells, they just don't survive. But the smaller cells do survive because they've got a greater amount of surface area compared to the volume inside, and so they're able to transport enough stuff in and out of the cell to keep the cell alive. So that's why cells are so small. Okay, I also would know this for the exam. So all cells have four things in common. So all cells have a plasma membrane, and that's just the outer covering that surrounds the cell. We'll take a look at that in more detail. And that's going to control what goes in and out of the cell. And then all cells have cytosol or cytoplasm. A lot of times we just use those terms interchangeably, but it's just talking about the fluid-like substance that's inside the cell. And then all cells will have DNA, and one DNA molecule makes up a chromosome, so sometimes we just call the DNA chromosomes. So all cells will have that, and then all cells have ribosomes. And the job of ribosomes is to make the proteins that the cells need. So I definitely would know the parts that all cells have in common, because that could definitely show up on the exam. Okay, there's two types of cells. So we've got the prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. So the big difference between them is the prokaryotic cells do not have a membrane-bound nucleus, and they don't have any membrane-bound organelles. So in these prokaryotic cells, you're not going to find things like mitochondria or chloroplasts. They just don't have those things. So the domains that are made up of prokaryotic cells would be the bacteria, and those are the ones that we're going to be focusing on. And then also another domain that has prokaryotic cells would be the archaea. And we're not going to really talk about them, so you don't have to really focus on them. But just remember the bacteria they are prokaryotes. And then for the eukaryotic cells, we're talking about domain eukarya here. And the kingdoms underneath the domain would be the animals, so the animal kingdom, and then the plant kingdom. So those are the two that we're going to focus on. And then we also have fungi and protists as well. They're also eukaryotes, but we're just not going to talk about them here in this module. So we'll just kind of focus on the animal and plant cells instead. So the eukaryotic cells are very different from the prokaryotic cells because they do have a membrane-bound nucleus and they do have membrane-bound organelles. So you will find things like mitochondria and chloroplasts in these eukaryotic cells. Okay, here's just a picture of a prokaryotic cell. This is a bacterial cell. And if we look inside here, we can see the DNA or chromosome here. And you can see that there's no membrane around the DNA, so there's no nucleus. And also in the cytoplasm here, you don't see any organelles. So there's nothing like mitochondria or chloroplasts in here. So they're pretty simple, not much to them. Okay, so the other thing we're going to take a look at with our eukaryotic cells is we're going to look at the difference between the animal and the plant cells. So this would also be good to know for the exam as well. So what are some of the differences between the plant and the animal cells? So the plant cells have cell walls, where the animal cells have no cell wall. Plant cells have the chloroplasts, that's where they do their photosynthesis. And obviously animal cells don't do photosynthesis, so they will have no chloroplasts. And then the plant cells also have a structure called a central vacuole. Animal cells do not have that, but they will have lysosomes, which plant cells do not have lysosomes. And the lysosomes are little membrane-bound sacs that are filled with digestive enzymes. So we'll take a look at those as well. Okay, here is a picture of an animal cell. And notice that around the outside, we don't have a cell wall. And inside, you don't see any chloroplasts, so not able to do photosynthesis. And then we do have some lysosomes. So these will be filled with digestive enzymes, and we'll talk about their function a little bit later. And because this is a eukaryotic cell, we do have a membrane-bound nucleus. So here's our membrane, and our DNA would be in here. So, and then we can see some other membrane-bound organelles inside here as well. Okay, and then here's a plant cell. So notice that we've got a cell wall around our plant cell, and plant cell walls are actually made out of cellulose. And then we've also got these chloroplasts, which are green because of the chlorophyll pigment they contain to capture the light energy. And this is where they're going to be doing their photosynthesis. And they've also got this central vacuole where they store water in there. And so we'll talk about what this does a little bit later. And because the plant cells are eukaryotic cells, they do have a nucleus. So they've got a membrane surrounding their DNA. And then they do have some other membrane-bound organelles as well. And the chloroplast is a membrane-bound organelle as well.